screen. If you just someone unmute yourself and say that that's working. Bear with me 1 moment. No, that's not the screen I want to share. Here we are. All right, is that working?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, now, like last time, if you prefer not to see the presentation and you want to see more faces, just drag it to the side a little bit, and you should be able to personalize what you're seeing. So this wasn't meant to be topical at all, and I'm aware that in the current climate it is slightly, but the plan was always to segue chronologically through history and to work through Beruriah, and really to start looking at Beruriah both as a person and what she added to our history and what she did for women in our history. And again, I'm aware that it has become in the last week or so more topical than it was, say, had I not missed last week's session and given it on Tuesday after all. So here we are, and as usual, we're going to start with a little bit of context, because without the context, we really can't understand the person at all. So we're going to first look at the historical context that Beruriah was functioning within. And we're looking now at the post-Beit HaMikdash era. So the second temple has now been destroyed. And that means that there's a dispersal again, because we'd encountered the first dispersal of Jewish people. This is now the second dispersal of Jewish people going into the diaspora. And what that means also is that we're starting to see this loss of the oral tradition, which has traditionally been handed down, teacher to student, rabbi to Talmud, teacher to student, and on and on and on, and forming so much more richness to the strictly written Torah. So the Sanhedrin is moving, that court of law, the premise of that holding of all of the oral traditions, of all of the extrapolations of the written Torah that's being held by these individuals and understood and debated and evolving by these individuals. That's at risk, which means that our entire heritage is now at risk of just fizzling out and not being passed on any longer. So it's to that backdrop that Beruriah and her contemporaries are functioning. So in the year about the year 190 CE is when the Mishnah, so the oral Torah, is finally redacted, which means it was written down, collected, all of these sort of disparate sayings and all of these halachic rulings and halachic conversations that had been had within the study houses and that had been given down as sort of edicts by the Sanhedrin, by that court of law, and that traditionally we were not allowed to record it in text. It was supposed to be an oral tradition. It was supposed to be part and parcel of the entire written and oral tradition that came as a package deal. Just like, there are plenty of things that you can't learn simply from a textbook, but you need to have training. You need to have intense one-to-one apprenticeships, because there's so much in the art and skill that needs to also be taught in person and passed down verbally and needs to be shown and given a practical lesson. So in a similar vein, it was the Sanhedrin occupied that space, or the oral Torah, the oral law, occupied that space of the passing down. And this was something, again, that we mentioned a few weeks ago when we spoke about Serach, that she represented the original oral Torah, that she represented that in the way in which she was this kind of oracle. She was that link to the past, but a strictly verbal, a strictly oral link. She was the holder of memories. So it's to the backdrop of this dispersal of the Sanhedrin, the dispersal of the Jewish communities, and the destruction of the places of Torah study, that the Mishnah, that the oral law is written down, and it's redacted in its final form in about 190 of the Common Era. So this is a time where is the backdrop of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba, who gathered together many guerrilla fighters against the Romans, and eventually claimed himself to be a messiah, and actually turned out to be a false messiah. The bloodthirsty, all of the bloodshed at Beitar, which was an absolute Holocaust. We were told that the Jewish blood ran like rivers after the massacre at Beitar, and Jews were spread out, were back into the diaspora and spread out around the world. So this is when Beruriah exists. So we've passed through the temple times, and we've moved into Mishnah times. So all of those discussions by rabbis are taking place and are being recorded. And eventually we're going to segue into the Talmudic times, the Talmud, which then takes even further discussion, rabbinic discussions, and adds to those original Mishnah verses, and sort of riffs on that, if you will. But it's the Mishnah period that we're talking about, that initial recording of the oral Torah. So Beruriah stands out as the only female voice contained within that original compilation of the oral law. So Beruriah is the only female influence in the halachic debates of the Mishnah period, the only female voice in the halachic debates. And she's recorded in several instances throughout the Talmud, throughout the Gemara. Sometimes her rulings are given more weight than some of her male contemporaries. But let's have a look at the first time that we see her. Hold on, I'm just moving my screen around so that I can see my content. All right, so in a Tosefta, actually, so this is a Tosefta about on a discussion about cooking vessels. And the question is, when does an oven become pure again? So we're giving an example of the voice and the weight that Beruriah's voice had. So a man of Kfar Hanania asks Shimon, the son of Rabbi Hanania ben Tardayon, and Shimon, the son of Rabbi Hanania ben Tardayon, he says, once that oven is moved from its place, that's when it becomes pure again. So again, these are semantics. The premise is that Rabbi Hanania's daughter said, when the oven's covering is removed. And when the argument was relayed in front of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, he says, his daughter, that's Rabbi Hanania's daughter, spoke better than his son. So she's given more weight. Her voice is given more weight in this halachic debate, and also possibly somewhat unhelpfully, she's pitted against a male voice in doing so. I'm not so certain that's a helpful thing to do, but regardless, her reputation. It starts here, but her reputation is built across numerous episodes that's scattered throughout the Gemara. And I think she's mentioned by name throughout the Gemara itself 7 times, but then in other texts sort of around that as well, she's quoted. But I think that her probably the most impactful episode is found in Gemara Pesachim, in the Talmud, in the Tractate Pesachim, where we see this kind of story where this man comes to Rabbi Simlai and he says to him, teach me the book of genealogies in 3 months. Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Simlai comes to Rabbi Yochanan and says, teach me the book of genealogies in 3 months. And Rabbi Yochanan takes a clod of dirt. It's really, I love how they paint these pictures in the Talmud. It's great. The Agadah is wonderful. He takes a clod of dirt, he throws it at him, and he says, Beruriah, the wife of Rabbi Meir and the daughter of Rabbi Hanania ben Tardayon, she is so sharp and she has such a good memory that she learned 300 halachas in one day from 300 sages. And nonetheless, she didn't fulfill her responsibility she couldn't even learn the book of genealogies in 3 years because it's especially long and difficult. And you reckon that I should teach you in 3 months when someone to the standard of Beruriah can't even learn it in 3 years? After this, I don't think I'm inclined to teach you at all. So it's an interesting story. I love these stories that give us glimpses into the lives of these Tanaim, of these sages. But what this story does as well is that Beruriah becomes this yardstick for intensive learning against which even male students are compared. So she becomes this not just the token woman who has a voice, the token woman who has learned a bit of Torah and has what to say in a halachic debate, but this launches her into an objective sage in her own right, pitted against male voices as well. So we keep getting these glimpses of Beruriah, not just as a woman, but even in her own right, just as a person, as a Torah scholar, as someone who's holding in Torah content, and her acuity, her sharpness, her knowledge, what she's drawing on is so immense that she's able to appear in the text alongside all of these other sages. And in that light, it would be, or I would think it would be easy to reduce Beruriah to a strictly academic and a logical character, someone who's sort of immersed in their texts, in their studying. But this isn't what we see. On the contrary, all the glimpses to which we are privy, we see her bringing a compassion as well to the table. She introduces a feminine sensitivity as well to the views of the rabbis around her. And let's look at one example of this. This appears again in the Talmud, in the Gemara and Brachot. It says that her husband, Rabbi Meir, and we'll look a little bit about who Rabbi Meir is slightly later, but Rabbi Meir, her husband, in their neighborhood, there were these hooligans who caused him a great deal of anguish. He might have lived in East Barnet. And Rabbi Meir prayed for Hashem to have mercy on them so that they should die. This is one of the greatest sages. He says these hooligans, they're so annoying, let them just die because they're hooligans. And Rabbi Meir's wife, Beruriah, says to him, well, hang on 1 second. What is your thinking? On what basis do you pray for the death of these hooligans? Are you basing yourself on the verse in Psalms, in Tehillim, that says, let sins cease from the land? And she corrects him and says, hang on, if you're interpreting that to mean let sinners cease from the land, well, that's not what it's writing. It says their sins, their transgressions should be cleared from the land. So hang on, Rabbi Meir, dear husband, you should be praying for their sins to stop, not for them to stop. So she gives him this teichacha, she rebukes him and tells him what he should be praying for. So rather, pray for God to have mercy on them, that they should repent, because if they repent, then the wicked will be no more, because they will have repented. And Rabbi Meir, the text says, the Gemara says that Rabbi Meir saw that Beruriah was correct, and he prayed for Hashem to have mercy on them, and they repented. So this is legitimizing just time and again through every episode that we see Beruriah having a voice. It gives her voice legitimacy simply by existing within this context of the Talmud, having the value of what she has said is made clear. It legitimizes her voice just by having her here present alongside all of these other voices that contribute to this corpus called the Talmud. So she's evidently, can you just let me know if the screen has changed for you? Can someone just give me a thumbs up, because mine isn't changing.
No, not changed.
You've not changed. Okay. I'm going to have to stop the screen share for a second. sorry, beg your pardon. So what's incredible is that Beruriah has this voice, has this legitimacy that's given to her voice. Her arguments, her views, her halachic decisions are being given weight and are taken seriously. Just going to attempt to reshare. Is that working? No. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties with my screen share. Okay, here we are. So Beruriah's injected a little bit of compassion. She's injected a little bit of a feminine sensitivity to her husband, Rabbi Meir, and his like very, very shut down attitude. There are hooligans, shut them down. And she gives another point of view. But she's also, another glimpse that we get into her is this religious zealotry that she has. And we have a couple of stories, a couple of really, really entertaining stories, I think, that again gives us this glimpse into her character, into her personality, this sort of chutzpahdik personality that she is. In Eruvin, in another area of another tractate of the Talmud of the Gemara, it relates more about Beruriah's wisdom. It says that Beruriah comes across a student who was whispering his studies rather than raising his voice. So I don't know why that's so strange, but she comes across someone, and for some reason she's quite offended that this guy, this student in the study house, is whispering his studies rather than using a loud voice to learn. And it says that she kicked him. And she says to him, isn't it written that ordered in all things and secure, right? She quotes from the book of Samuel, from the book of Shmuel, the second book of Shmuel. And she says, which indicates that if the Torah is ordered on your 248 limbs, that is, what she's trying to say is, if you exert your entire body in studying the Torah, then it will be secure, it will be remembered. And if not, then it will not be secure. And the Gemara relates that it was similarly taught in a Brisa, so this is a Mishnaic term, that Rabbi Eliezer had a student who would study quietly, and after 3 years he forgot his studies. So what is she trying to tell this student? She's trying to say, stop whispering, stop being so quiet in your studies. You're not going to remember anything if you just whisper it to yourself. Use a nice loud voice when you learn, because if you use a nice loud voice, then you're more immersed in your studies and you're not going to forget it. But to tell him this, she gives him a good swift kick. That's a lesson he's not going to forget. And it's a lesson that we're not going to forget. And it appears in the Talmud, in the Gemara, as a sort of portrait of her and the kind of personality that she had as well. So she's got a voice, but she's also got pizzazz. Another episode that's related, and also another quite amusing one, is the story of the man who asks for directions. Now, tell me if you've ever met a man who asks for directions anyway. So already this is quite a standout story. But it relates also in the tractate of Eruvin, and also in the Talmud, in the Gemara. It says, having discussed wise speech, this is in the general discussion of wise speech and the wisdom of Jewish women, the Gemara cites a story about Beruriah. It says that Rabbi Yosei HaGalili was walking along. Rabbi Yosei, who comes from the Galilean, is walking along the way, and he meets Beruriah. And he says to Beruriah, on which path shall we walk in order to get to Lod? Be'ezo derech nelech lelod. Which way should I walk to get to Lod? And Beruriah says to him, Shoteh, which basically means you idiot, you fool. Didn't the sages say, don't talk too much with women? This is not sneers, this is not modest to ask me in 4 words what you could have asked in 2. Be'ezo lelod. You should have said your question more succinctly. Which way to Lod? Be'ezel Lod. Shoteh. which is just a wonderful glimpse again. It's just a wonderful picture of this woman who's you know, she's passionate, she's unapologetic, she's caustic, she's witty, and she's humorous, and her strong character is evidenced in the texts that we have. We only have so much textual information here, but what it does, what all of those glimpses do, is paint this wonderful picture of her. So it's no wonder we have, you know, she's become this legend in Jewish history and Jewish memory and Jewish literature, and it's you know, she's just a really cool person. She's not a retiring person. She doesn't fade into the background of her husband's picture or her father's picture, which she could actually do, because she was both the daughter of and the wife of very, very significant sages, very, very significant Torah leaders and Torah scholars. And all of her, I mean, all of these male contemporaries that you know, she lives alongside and studies alongside, it seems really confronting that this is the context that she's functioning within, and yet we still get to see her. She takes front and center several times. It doesn't seem sensical. She shouldn't be appearing in the way that she does. All logic would dictate that she disappears from the scene, particularly when she is surrounded by these very strong male voices who in their own right are very important and very highly regarded sages with lots of legalistic background and lots of halachic discourse of their own. So I think it might be useful to look at Beruriah within another context to try to understand this. And this is, I suppose, a micro context, that of her family, the context of family, of a network of supportive figures who evidently respect and value her skills and her contributions, and whose priorities seem to be very aligned with Beruriah's priorities. The man that she's married to, Rabbi Meir, and this here is an image, is a photograph of the tomb of Rabbi Meir, who's buried in Tiberia, in Tiberias, also known as Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes, Rabbi Meir who performs nisim, who performs wonders. And just a couple of quotes that are attributed to Rabbi Meir. He says, "He that gives his daughter to an Am Haaretz, to an ignoramus, is as though he put her before a lion." So someone who's giving his daughter in wedlock, in marriage to an ignoramus, he may as well put her before a lion, which suggests the kind of respect that he has for a woman, and suggests that it doesn't make sense to marry a woman off to an ignorant man, to an Am Haaretz, to an ignorant man. He also says, another quote that's attributed to Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes, "Why was the Torah given to Israel, to Bnei Israel?" And he answers, "Because they are impetuous." And it seems in that context, it looks that she isn't necessarily that maverick that we assume. She's simply falling into step with the expectations of the people around her, her father, who teaches her Torah, her husband, who both of whom seem not to discriminate when it comes to Torah study, and seem to have a very democratic attitude towards its dissemination and opportunities for learning. If you're going to give your daughter in marriage to an Am Haaretz, you might as well give her to a lion, as if to say, we respect her enough that you'll marry her off to someone who has a respect for learning, who has a brain in his head, who has a mind, who has a soul. So within this context, it makes sense that Beruriah is the woman that she is. And furthermore, you know, Rabbi Meir seems to have a huge respect for this chutzpah, for this impetuousness. You know, why was a Torah given to Israel? Because they are impetuous, if you will, that outspokenness that Beruriah seems to have. He seems to hold this trait up as a positive, even an endearing characteristic. It's one that should be valued, because it's the trait that Hashem seemingly sees in the Jewish people, and it's because of that trait that Hashem decides to give the Jewish people the Torah. That's why we're the chosen people, because we're impetuous, because we're hot-headed, because we have chutzpah. No one can argue that the Jewish people don't have chutzpah, and it seems to be that he found this chutzpah, this impetuousness, in his wife Beruriah. But again, Beruriah isn't the dry and academical character that we might mistake her for. She has a depth and she has a compassion that speaks volumes, and we encounter a story of the death of her sons one Shabbat, and it's a story that's gone down into history and put her very firmly in the place of an Eshet Chayil, is what we're told. And the text reads like this, or the story goes like this: one Shabbat, while her husband Rabbi Meir Baal Hanes, while he's out at shul, her two sons pass away. It doesn't say under what circumstances, but it does say that her two sons, their two sons, die. And Beruriah is concerned. She doesn't want to break the news to Rabbi Meir on Shabbat. She doesn't want to destroy the peace of his Shabbat experience. So she decides she's going to somehow keep the news from him until after Shabbat, which means that she suffers her distress, her grief, in private for all of that time. Her husband comes in at Shalosh Sudos time, at Seudah Shlishit in the afternoon, and he says, where are my sons? Where are my boys? So call them and we'll have Seudah together. And Beruriah says, she makes excuses for them. She says, I think they're elsewhere. I think they're eating at their friends. You know, they're teenagers. They're eating at their friend's house. They're not going to be in for a while. He asks again later. He's going out to shul. Where are my boys? I'm going to take my boys to shul. And again, Beruriah makes their excuses. They're with friends. I think they'll be back after Shabbat. It's fine, you go to shul and they'll be here when you come back. He comes back after Shabbat and he's making Havdalah. And he says, where are my sons? Where are they? Where are the boys? And Beruriah sits him down. She says, I have a question. I have a legalistic, a halachic question to ask you. And Rabbi Meir, he says to her, well, go on. She says, some time ago, a man came and he gave me something to keep for him. He gave me something in trust, and now he wants to take it back. Should we return it to him or should we keep it? And Rabbi Meir says, well, how is that even a question? If you have an object in trust for someone, then you have to return it to its owner when they want it back. And Beruriah said to him, well, I didn't want to return it without checking it by you. You know, I just need your stamp of approval that I can give it back. You know, he doesn't really understand what she's saying. This is an open and shut case to him. Someone's lent her something and she has to give it back. So she takes him by the hand and she leads him up to their room. She takes him to the bed where their corpses are, and she removes the sheet that's covering them. And when he sees his two sons lying there dead on the bed, he begins to cry and he says, my sons, my sons. And at that time, Beruriah says to her husband, but didn't you say to me that I must return this trust to its master, to its rightful owner? And Rabbi Meir says, God gives and God has taken away. Baruch Dayan, oh, blessed be the name of the Lord, quoting Eob. Beruriah is philosophical in the face of tragedy. She greets tragedy, grief, distress, she greets it head on, and she attributes it to God. She's able to see beyond the grief. And what's more, she buffers her husband from it. So she suffers it alone in order to buffer her husband from that grief and to break it to him slowly. And according to Mishlei, according to Proverbs, to the Midrash on Mishlei, It's because of this episode, that episode of Beruriah buffering her husband and breaking that news and being able to be philosophical about the greatest tragedy in her life. Because of that episode, that Beruriah becomes the muse for that first verse of Eshet Chayil, that prayer that we say every Friday night, a woman of valor, who can find? Rabbi Hanina said, in this way she comforted him, and his mind was set at ease. This is Rabbi Meir. Regarding such an instance, does it say, a good wife, Eshet Chayil mi yimtza, who can we find? So she becomes this muse, she becomes this paragon of piety, of philosophy, of spirituality, of someone who can see beyond simply what's happening in this physical world and attribute it to another force, to a godliness. And I think this begs the question of family context, of further family context. Beruriah existed within national pain and national torture and national upheaval. Her people were being brutally persecuted, murdered, hunted, haunted, chased down. Anyone who had anything to do with Torah study or Torah teaching or Torah practice was being brutally hounded and destroyed and tortured. And that includes her father, Rabbi Hanania ben Teradayan, who was one of, we hear this name. I don't know if, does anyone know where we heard this name in particular? I'll give you a clue. It's in the context of 9 other.
It's one of the 10 martyrs.
That's it. So one of the 10. So that's it. Which is read on, if you're Ashkenazi, it's read on, we read it on Yom Kippur. If you're Sephardi, then we read it on Tisha B'Av. And her father, Rabbi Hanania ben Teradayon, is one of those 10 martyrs whose brutal death is horrifically related. The hands of the Roman armies is retold and read on Yom Kippur. He's one of the 10 martyrs. And because her father is caught teaching Torah, his wife is also killed. That's Beruriah's mother, is also killed. And her sister, Rachel, we're told, is taken into service in a brothel in Rome. And that's her punishment. So all around her entire family context is one of suffering, is one of persecution, is one of pain. And here's some images cobbled together. The Maiden of Israel. I don't know if that is actually anything to do with her story, or with her sister Rachel's story, but it looked like a good image, so I've stuck it in there anyway. So one of the 10 martyrs, her father, Rabbi Hanania ben Teradayon, so he's brought before the Romans for judgment. And to recap this story very briefly, they say to him, so why did you occupy yourself with Torah? Why were you studying Torah? And Rabbi Hanania ben Teradayon says to them, well, my Lord commanded me. And they immediately sentence him to death by means of burning. They sentenced his wife to execution by decapitation, and his daughter was condemned to sit in a brothel. And where the generally accepted understanding is that no, this daughter is not Beruriah, but this is her sister, Rachel. And the manner in which they tortured her father, they wrap him up in wool that's been soaked so that they can prolong his torture before he eventually dies. But very famously, he says before he dies, his students ask him while he's being tortured, they say, what do you see? And he responds to them, I see the parchment burning. They're burning him together with the Sefer Torah. I see the parchment burning, but the letters, they're flying up to heaven. The parchment is burning, but the letters are flying up to heaven, as if to say, you can crush my body, but you can't crush the Jewish soul, the Jewish neshama. So this is the tragedy of her family, a family that's hounded, a family that's destroyed by the Romans, a sister who's taken into prostitution, forced prostitution, a father who's tortured and killed and made a martyr of, a mother who's also decapitated. And then there's Beruriah and her husband, Rabbi Meir Balhanes, Rabbi Meir. And we're told that Beruriah says, this is in the Gemara, it relates that Beruriah says to her husband, Rabbi Meir, she says, how can I live while my sister is sitting in a brothel? You've got to do something to save her. You've got to be the hero here. So we're told that Rabbi Meir, he goes and he tries to save her. He takes a purse full of coins that he can use as a bribe, and he goes to break her out of prison. Here's a nice Banksy, to break her out of this brothel. It says that Rabbi Meir, he goes in, he bribes his way in, he bribes his way out, he saves her sister, he brings her out, and because of that, he's also condemned by the Romans. And the Romans put a picture of him on every gate and say, this is a wanted man. And because he's now wanted throughout, the Roman, across all the Roman empire, so he's got to run, he's got to flee. So it says in Avodah Zarah, and this is where we're going to end our Talmudic endeavors. It says that Rabbi Meir arose, he fled, and he arrives in Babylon. He's now in Babylon, and the Gemara notes there are those who say that he fled due to embarrassment from the incident involving his wife Beruriah. Now, what embarrassment is this? Is this because his sister-in-law was taken as a sex slave? She's taken into captivity in a brothel because she sat in Rome, having to service the needs of all the Romans? No, it's quite a nebulous idea here. It's quite a nebulous statement. What embarrassments arising from the incident involving Beruriah? It's quite vague. So this is hundreds of years, even 1,000 years later. We have Rashi commenting on this episode here, that Beruriah incident. And Rashi understands it thus. Some say because of the incident with Beruriah. Well, what is this incident? One time, Beruriah mocked what the sages said. The sages said in Kiddushin, women are light-headed or of a weak conviction. They're fickle. The sages said, women are fickle. And Beruriah is affronted by this. She mocked it. She made fun of this saying. So Rabbi Meir says, by your life, in the end, you, Beruriah, you're going to concede to their words. You're going to eat those words. So what does Rabbi Meir do? Rashi relates that Rabbi Meir commands one of his students to test her with a matter of sin, or in other words, he sends one of his students to seduce her, to prove to her that yes, women are fickle, women are lightheaded, women are they have weak conviction. And the student, it says that he wore her down, he pleaded with her for many days until finally she agreed to be seduced by him. Now, we're not given the details of this, and the way that I learned this when I was younger was that it wasn't necessarily a sexual seduction, but it was a seduction of the mind. Meet me, or however PG we want palatable to us, because it's not a happy story. It doesn't paint women in a good light. It doesn't paint her husband, Rabbi Meir, in a good light either. It doesn't really paint anybody in a good light. But however we want to wing this story, she agrees. And when she finds out that there's been a setup, she's so embarrassed that she commits suicide. She strangles herself. And out of shame for himself, shame for Beruriah, who knows? Rashi says out of shame, out of embarrassment, Rabbi Meir runs away. This is the way that Rashi understands that vague Talmudic reference of the incident involving his wife Beruriah. So, if it's wildly jarring to us, because everything that we've seen until this point does not lend itself to this picture of Beruriah as someone who would be easily seduced, of someone who would fall for something like that. She doesn't seem to be someone who's got a weak conviction. She seems a very Torah true individual. So however we want to understand the story, and I don't understand it really, this is what Rashi says. If it was simply a myth, like a very vague, and if it were unrecorded in any legitimate manner, then that would be one thing. But this is Rashi. This is Rashi's commentary on the Talmud itself. It's not, a story of a story of a story about a myth, about a legend that may or may not have been in our history or may have been adopted in from another history. This is Rashi. We don't dare claim that it's not rooted in emet, in truth, but we can admit, or I certainly can admit, to the difficulty in understanding it, in the fact that it doesn't seem to fit with that character portrayal that we've constructed until this point, from her appearance, from Beruriah's appearance in the text, from the voice that we've created, or that she's created for herself. It doesn't work. And how can it then make sense that we use Beruriah, and we still use Beruriah as a flag bearer, as of the Eshet Chayil, of this gold standard woman of valor, and this role model of compassion, of philosophical takes on life and the afterlife and connection to God? How does it fit? It's a really tricky one, and I admit that I haven't got the knowledge, I haven't got the words to properly address this conundrum, but instead I want to take a very small Reader's Digest tangent to look at a couple of other women in more recent Jewish history and see how their stories align with that of Beruriah. And the first that we have is actually, just to rewind slightly, legacy of Beruriah, which we'll revisit shortly. But there are some mythical elements to the Beruriah personality. But we're told, or we're not told, there aren't really any proof texts, but it's suggested that Beruriah used to wear tefillin. There isn't a textual evidence for that, but she's been the subject of many interpretations and reinterpretations, and the story, particularly of her ending, has been the subject of many reinterpretations to try and make it sit a little bit better with the person that we seem to know until that point. But what are some other stories, a couple of other women that we see in more recent Jewish history? Well, we've got the Maid of Ludmir. These are a couple of women who live in the 19th century. The Maid of Ludmir, I want to move this away. The Maid of Ludmir, Chana Rachel Verbemacher, who lives in the 1900s. So from a very, very early age, she displays this religious fervor and this intense Torah study. And it makes her so anxious when she's been betrothed to this guy that she grew up with. She just gets so stressed. It stresses her out that she breaks off an engagement and she decides that I just can't get married. Her life is also beset by tragedy. She loses her mother at quite an early age. She's quite young, and she's really destroyed by grief. It says that she goes and she visits her mother's grave all the time. She's a hermit, except for the fact that she goes out every once in a while or very frequently rather, to spend time near her mother's tombstone, near her mother's grave. And it's one day she falls asleep by her mother's grave, and she falls into an unconsciousness. And when she wakes up, she has this religious epiphany, and suddenly she becomes this Hasidic leader. She attains this following of people. She's teaching, she's learning, she's become this public religious figure. And she teaches both men and women. And she has this very famous and very well-attended weekly Shabbat shiur at Shalosh Sudos time. And legend has it, again, legend, myth, who knows, that she wears talis and tefillin. And also that after her father dies, she's the one who says Kaddish for him, which at the time, nowadays, it's quite usual for women to recite Kaddish, but at that time, it was very unusual. In fact, it was very unusual for women to even attend a synagogue. And eventually, you know, she's got this huge Hasidic following. People keep coming and asking for her blessings and asking her for teachings. And she has, you know, it's like she has a Beit Midrash. She has a study hall where people flock to hear her teaching. But eventually, one day, she's convinced to marry because someone steps in, one of the older rabbis steps in, tells her it's not appropriate, she's not married, and eventually convinces her to marry. She divorces. She marries again. She divorces. But at the same time, maybe because of those marriages or because of the divorces, who knows, her popularity wanes after her marriages. And eventually she retires to Jerusalem. She moves to Yerushalayim. And her career as a pseudo-rabbi is finished. And she lives out the rest of her life in Yerushalayim until she dies in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s. The Maid of Ludmir is how she was known, it's how she taught, and it's how she died. There are some striking similarities between Beruriah and this so-called Maid of Ludmir. There's this intellectual prowess in the study house. There's this almost universal recognition of their abilities to speak on halacha. There is this absolute dedication to Torah. There is the fact that they adopt a voice, a legitimate voice in the mainstream or almost mainstream Torah world. But also there's this theme of the nadir following a zenith. Following these incredible highs, there's this plummet to nothing or to very little in the case of the Maid of Ludmir, of the case of Chana Rachel Verbemacher. Somehow these achievements, their respective achievements, which really mirror one another quite closely, those achievements are unsustainable. Something has got to give. And here we encounter another female scholar, Raina Batya Berlin, who also, she's a bit of a contemporary, although as far as I know, the two weren't aware of one another, but she is quite a contemporary of the Maid of Ludmir. She lives in the 19th century. She lives in the 1800s. And her family context is a little bit different because she's born into a family of very influential spiritual and intellectual Torah leaders of the Volozhin dynasty. If anyone's ever been to or heard of the Reb Chaim of Volozhin, the Volozhin Yeshiva, it was an incredibly huge institution of Jewish learning that had a huge following. But Raina Batya, she learns alone. She doesn't adopt a teaching role. She doesn't become a pseudo-Rebbe figure. On the contrary, she doesn't experience a high from her Torah learning, but really she's embittered by her situation. She sees all of these limits and constraints. And we're told by everything that we know about her really is because of her nephew, the Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein, who writes the Makor Baruch. And in his book, Makor Baruch, he gives these descriptions of his aunt, Raina Batya. He says it was her habit to sit always near the winter oven that was in her kitchen, even during the summer, with all sorts of books spread before her on the table. And just paint this picture in your mind. There was the Bible, there was the Tanakh, Mishnayot, Ein Yaakov, various midrashim, and all of her focus and concentration were on the books. Her hand hardly moved from them. The picture that I have in my mind, I could switch out Raina Batya for any of the great Torah scholars. She's adopted the same kind of role, sitting there ensconced in her own library, in her own world of Torah books. But the Makor Baruch, Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein, he goes on. But of all that concerned the maintenance of the household, she knew little, almost nothing. Now, to us, with our sensitivities, it doesn't seem to be, who cares? It's neither here nor there. But in the 19th century, It's not quite, that doesn't taste so good, does it? He says, and again, this paints a picture of her bitterness. More than once, he says, I heard her complain and bemoan in sorrow and pain, in bitter mood, in a bitter mood and with bitter soul, of the pain of the bitter fate and narrow portion of woman in this life. Because the fulfillment of positive time-bound commandments, all of those positive time-bound mitzvot, such as tefillin, tzitzit, sukkah, lulav, and much, much more, had been denied them. She was disturbed, she was pained even more by the desecration of women's honor, by their lowly position, inasmuch as it was forbidden to teach them Torah. Remember, at this point, it is not normal, it is not normative for women to learn Torah to the same kind of degree as men did. But the standout here, how bitter was my aunt's soul? The picture that he paints is one of bitterness, of twisted anger. And he recounts arguments that she has with like with red hot anger about all of the constraints that are holding her back from being a Torah scholar. So despite all of her solo learning, she feels that she's being held back. Something has got to give. And I think that a theory of, I beg your pardon. I think that a theory linking really the Maid of Ludmir and Beruriah and their almost mythical, legendary stories, they serve another purpose. They serve another purpose that's been suggested. And that is, are they presenting a cautionary tale? This is what happens if you play with fire. This is what happens if you pursue Torah learning and place it above all. This is what happens if you try to adopt a male role ensconced in the Torah world, in a world of Bible, in a world of learning, in a world immersed as a Torah scholar. So I'm just taking a break because my screen has stopped sharing again. I'm sorry. No, it's not shifting screens. Sorry about that. So while the story of patriarchy, Beruriah is a standout case. She's unique both in her capabilities as well as her opportunities, and unique also because of the network that surrounded and supported her, and that we didn't see historically after that, not until very contemporary times. Sorry, can someone give me a thumbs up if the screen is changing, because I seem to have lost the presentation.
On Trailblazers.
Yeah, so it's not shifting. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop the share again. Oh, there it is. Okay, great, it's back. What are we on now?
Cautionary tale.
Okay, fine, we're back. Thank you. So we've got this cautionary tale that seems thematically to link these women. Something has to give. If you're going to play with fire, you're never quite going to make it. There's going to be a trade-off somewhere. It's not a happy ending. None of these tales have a happy ending. And we've tried to reinterpret Beruriah's story outside of the text that we're given. But the text remains. We can't rewrite that. We can try to attribute new interpretations. We can try to layer more story, more myth, more legend on top of it, but that doesn't delete the text that we're given, the evidence that we're given. Do these women stand up as simply cautions to other women? In a way, Beruriah is, or I would argue actually, I would argue that Beruriah certainly was a trailblazer because she set the stage for women's study and leadership. Had she not existed at that time, had she not made her mark at the time when she did, there would be absolutely no legitimizing of the female voice, of the halachic voice. There would be no precedent for that. We can't take her words out of the Talmud. There's no way to simply, splice them out and put them elsewhere. She's there. Just like we can't write Esther's name out of the book of Esther, she's there. And no matter how much you want to, how much the Hamadiyya would want to, censor female images or female news, you can't take that out. Likewise, we can't edit an already redacted Gemara. Beruriah is there and she's there to stay. And it's so important that she is there because she sets the precedent for weight behind a female, halachic weight behind a female voice. And more so for female Torah study. So she trailblazes that, certainly. And I think that being a theme that we've encountered throughout this series, and I've lost the slide here, it's not coming back, but we're going to have to just wing it. A theme that we've encountered throughout this 7 Women series is that of words, is that of voice, is that of legacy. We're first introduced to the notion of an oral tradition in the life story of Serach bat Asher, who's that oracle, that wise woman, that keeper of memories, who was able to transmit verbally what would otherwise have been lost in the sands of time. So Serach, we said, represented collective memory that could then be passed down to the next generation. And it seems pertinent that the first recording of the oral tradition, in the form of the Mishnah and Talmud, and certainly the Talmud, features at least one woman influencing the content that's recorded. The method of the oral tradition is already a very feminine one, and we discussed that previously. We encountered that numerous times, that idea of legacy, of passing on, of transmitting, of that idea of transmission is one that is very feminine. It's intrinsic to womankind, whether or not that's biologically expressed. And remember, we when we learned about Serach, we hear nothing about her having children, nor is there any conclusive evidence of Queen Esther bearing children, and yet she was so instrumental in the transmission of Torah, in the rebuilding of the second temple and the next generation, and passing on, allowing for that continuity of the Jewish people. But the important thing is securing a future for the next generation, spiritually as well as physically. Beruriah had a hand in transmitting Torah, and she was accepted as a conduit, and her place in our history is recognized from 2,000 years ago. It's recognized, it's legitimized, importantly, and it's respected. And that's blazed a trail for women at all times. And that is probably the most important part of Beruriah's legacy, that she does set the stage for women's study and for women's leadership. She legitimizes the female voice within a halachic context, and she's there for all of history. There is no removing her from history. And at that, I'm going to stop the live stream and open for any comments.